Everyone, and apologies for not being there in person. I'd like to thank very much the staff of the Education University of Hong Kong for making my contribution possible. Now, my paper is an exploration of academic subjectivities as they have emerged via shifting government discourses over some decades in higher education. It's primarily the story of one sector, the United Kingdom sector. And I left employment for life as an independent scholar about 8 years ago. So this is probably a good time for me to offer a perspective on that story. So when I first went to university, just as Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, academic identities were not visibly under contest. But Mrs. Thatcher had promised to be a reforming Prime Minister. She was a devotee of Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, and she introduced his doctrine known as monetarism, which advocated control of the money supply and extolled the discipline of the market with very little state intervention. It was the beginning of the dismantling of the welfare state and public services, and the beginning of an attack on universities. To those of us in cultural studies, this approach has become known as neoliberalism, the notion that every human endeavour must be governed by the market and must be financialised, privatised, competitive and efficient. Over and above economics, this has become a governing principle, a governmentality, a strategy for rendering subjects and states governable, even while those subjects believe they have autonomy. This paper is about how this has affected or even effected UK academic subjectivities, forged in a culture which admits only the discipline of the market. I will take a Foucauldian view of subjectivities as being informed by an individual's self-perception, social roles, and power knowledge and their relation to them. Discourses about certain subjects circulate and structure, even limit, our understandings. The interplay between structure, culture, agency, and discourse means that new formations of academic labour are relational. So, for example, when we call students customers, that means that academic subjectivity is shifted. They become service providers. Equally, when we permit the concept of a manager, the academic workforce assumes the stance of proletariat. So in this way, academic subjectivities are forcibly reshaped within the discursive paradigms of their managers. The project of neoliberal governmentality in universities is for the institution to produce its ideal employee. No longer are knowledge, ideas, and intellectual agility the most highly valued gifts in the academy, nor are they seen as the characteristics of promotable academics. As the discourse shifted from academic values to the values of the market, academics slowly started to conceive of themselves in different terms. It was not just the discourse that constructed the new subjectivity. There were rather techniques of shaping and controlling behaviours, which Bendix Peterson and Davies describe as a kind of dressage, shaping the individualised, vulnerable, competitive, useful subjects into the generic workers who will facilitate the flow of capital. But even within the neoliberal order, the discourse and formations kept shifting. So I introduce in rough order several priorities that I was subject to. In the late 1980s, it became a concern that universities were not graduating students with the required skills and mindset of entrepreneurship. To this end, a whole load of enterprise officers were appointed and assigned to each faculty in a university. In arts and humanities, their role seemed to be to focus students' minds on careers in STEM and in business, organising startups and so on. But it became much wider across the university, so that enterprise became featured as a key competency on academic job descriptions, and foreshadowed an era when there would be an expectation that professors would bring in grant money and earn their own salaries and research expenses. And professors started to be seen as a kind of entrepreneurial Praetorian Guard within universities. They were asked to build the university's brand with things like outreach activities and media interviews. And as we know, branding is all about the manipulation of appearances. But when that is made the person's priority, you know that academic values have been forsaken. So it was a world which created posts like the Associate Dean of Eureka Moments at Bristol University, or the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Ambition, Innovation and Student Satisfaction at Anglia Ruskin. And so the message was received that your knowledge and research has no intrinsic value to the university. It's only significant and worthy of investment, both personal and financial, if it can be commercially exploited. It became apparent that even if the rewards accrued to just a few, they made the wider body of academics more malleable and compliant. In the managerial university, we replaced autonomous, self-managing academics with workload models, deference to line managers, along with new transgressions such as insubordination and endless performance management. Michael Rosen, who is Professor of Children's Literature at Goldsmiths, University of London, is a former children's laureate, and he recently tweeted, "Exciting times at my university. Apparently, I, along with many others, will have to prove I am working at the level of my role. Actually, I don't think I can be asked." Now, this appeared in response to threats of redundancies and selection for redundancy. But the idea that someone so distinguished and of such stature, who is clearly enhancing the university's reputation, that he should need to undergo job matching and a skills audit and a regrading procedure is an affront, and at the very least, an undermining of professionalism and autonomy. But this is what efficiency and corporatization has brought us. Endless accountability and rationalization for those whose labour adds value to the university, while management has proliferated. There has been an expansion of about 60% in the last 12 years. Let's take a look at Coventry University, where there is now a senior management team of 20 people. So a vice-chancellor, a provost, 2 vice-provosts, 4 deputy vice-chancellors, 10 pro-vice-chancellors, and 1 chief people officer and a group registrar. And all of them have personal assistants. When I checked this a few days ago, the whole lineup had changed from when I started writing this paper about a month ago. The student body is about 28,000, and the university has announced 100 million in cost cutting and say they have to make difficult decisions on staffing. Well, we now encounter the metricized academic, where audit has become a central organizing principle. As the new managerial class showed off their new MBAs, they deployed procedures common in corporations but unknown in academia. Our working lives are now so audited that they are structured around the requirement to undergo rituals of verification, things that really don't add value or make a difference to the way you work, but they are nevertheless imposed upon you. Peterson and Davies say that such is their prevalence that the behaviour of academics has been transformed so that they are interpolated primarily as auditees. Now, the original sin in UK academia was the inauguration of research selectivity, now known as the Research Excellence Framework, inaugurated in 1986. It was an audit of the nation's research, and it was justified as offering accountability for the public spend on university research and generally providing a picture of the quality of research in the UK and ensuring that monies would go to the best research centres. But it was so constraining that if your work is interdisciplinary, or if it veers away from the departmental orthodoxy, then your outputs, as they call people's work, might not be submitted to the ref. And that's an outcome which is career limiting at best, because if you want to move jobs, you very often need to demonstrate that you are refable in the terminology that's often used. There's also evidence that this has resulted in the scope of research, particularly in the social sciences, but also in the sciences, the hard sciences, being narrowed in the direction of orthodoxy. The constraint of metrics causes the content of research to change as researchers attempt to mirror what is hot, i.e., what is likely to get funding under the shifting priorities of research councils. And so only about 20% of applications to research grant funding bodies get funded. And I've observed as well that we all tend to discount even solid scholarship, things like book reviews, for example, which can be quite influential if they're not refable. And there's currently a question about where monographs will stand in the next ref. So an understandable but regrettable response is to become the gamified academic. Our research, our judgment, our curiosity are subdued in the service of following managerial directions. As Kuldever writes, why does critique not translate into resistance, but instead appears to serve organizational reproduction? The academic turns the surveillant gaze against herself, self-monitors, and keeps comparing her own quantified measures of performance to that of others. Butler and Spolstra have even given us an account of a gamified academic conference, and I'm hoping this one doesn't fill that particular profile. But they experienced a conference challenge whereby participants ascended a leaderboard and won badges by demonstrating conference engagement, by attending sessions or posting messages in the chat. It's one manifestation of what Ball et al. Identify as racketeering behaviour, offering guidance to younger academics designed to normalise monopolies of hierarchy and domination, such as teaching academics how to shape their papers for top-tier journals and how to write formulaic articles that will be published. This is academia in 2024, at once blurring the distinction between work and play, but also moulding our behaviours and our subjectivities out of alignment with rational judgment and autonomy. In many universities across the world, there is a war on arts, humanities, and critical studies. Japan, Greece, United States, Brazil, Hungary have all singled out race or gender studies as the main, but not only targets. Whenever there are job cuts, there is an even greater impact on our casualised colleagues. As courses, subjects, and modules are cancelled, so are there opportunities to develop research specialisms or to widen their teaching expertise. Because, of course, neoliberalism demands a disposable workforce, which has brought us flexible career paths, in inverted commas, which are in fact limiting and very provisional. And to our shame, we have come to accept this as part of the support structure for tenured colleagues. It goes without saying that universities are knowledge institutions. Their sustainability depends on an investment in training the staff who work within them. There are no shortcuts to academic careers. They inevitably require long periods of training in highly specialised areas. This requires academic, personal, and financial dedication on the part of the individual and on the part of the institution that employs them. But for the individual, this comes without any guarantee of what the government wishes us to view as return on investment. In other words, many take the risks, but few are rewarded with the academic post that enables good work to happen and academic freedom. The wastage of their talent and investment stands as a rebuke to all university systems. So unfortunately, the future looks like casualisation, even for the most senior academics. Many UK universities have created the contradiction of the underperforming professor who is subject to 6 monthly reviews and crude targets for grant capture, for publishing in journals with high impact factors, and for sustaining graduate student throughput. They're not permitted any accrual of reputation and nothing to allay differential performance in any area. The criteria in all areas must be met every year, not just over the course of an academic career. In this way, any prestige associated with the rank of professor must be considered contingent, as professors too join the academic precariat and indentured servitude. And so we arrive at the panoptical academic. As performance expectations and audit have intensified, academics at all levels are feeling the pressure of surveillance in all their activities. In research, even before beginning the inquiry, the researcher must lay out what the findings, outcomes, and impact of the research will be, including the journals and conferences where the work will be published. How you are supposed to determine this, nobody really knows. But there will be assessors who will monitor whether your assurances and promises have been fulfilled, and they will question any deviation from the script. The UK has a history of adding more and more audits, such as now the Teaching Excellence Framework. Using this and the COVID epidemic as justification, universities now routinely demand lecture capture. Although their licenses are only for educational purposes, we know that this has been misused and that certain academics have been monitored either politically or for suspected performance deficits. We can add to the list of the panopticon appraisals, research audits, teaching observations, internal and external subject reviews, reviews of your grading patterns and the time taken to deliver feedback, and my own personal irritation, the space utilization survey, where people with clipboards would come round to every single class and monitor how long you were there, how many students were there, and even monitor when you were in your office. When the academic is no longer trusted to work autonomously with good judgment and no longer regarded as a valued and unique asset, but a temporary, inert, interchangeable instrument who's subject to tight control, you haven't got surveillance, you've got objectification. And it's objectification to demand that academics account for each minute of their day in terms of productivity which are intelligible to a human resources manager. So hello to the academic workload model, where each individual has to sit down in an evening and post hoc diagnose their day's activity into categories of teaching, teaching-related activity, scholarship, research, and a general catch-all academic management activity. Each category has a notional and grossly insufficient hours attached, with the sum amounting to 36 to 38 hours per week, which you're contractually paid for. But the real insult is that non-academics have drawn their boundary around what counts as work. Forbidden are moments of distraction or conversation where new ideas might bubble to the surface. Also excluded are those activities which arise unplanned during the year, like PhD examining or invited lectures, conferences, peer reviewing of research, for instance, evaluating journal articles or reviewing book manuscripts. These are not paid activities. They're scholarly obligations, and they're not always apparent when your workload is calculated at the beginning of an academic year. Mysteriously, though, the surveyed academic becomes the invisible academic when it comes to claiming compensation for hours worked outside of the panopticon. Once academics had been objectified, deprofessionalized, and sidelined from any decision-making in the university, vice-chancellors were free to enforce managerial practices of top-down autocracy, verging on authoritarianism. We've witnessed a slide from dirigism, which is state intervention in policy-making, to authoritarianism, whereby governments have felt empowered to pressure universities to conform to unpopular ideological stances. We see this most clearly now in certain US states like Florida, where there has been a declared war on wokeness and a campaign to outlaw critical race studies. This has been presented as a necessary intervention to protect academic freedom, when in reality, it's a targeted assault on precisely that. Just last month, we witnessed the most shocking scenes at Columbia University in New York University, Emory, UCLA, and several others, where students were peacefully protesting and were attacked and removed by police with accusations of trespassing. Trespass at a university where you're enrolled and where you pay fees, where you should experience freedom and protection. In the neoliberal marketized university, the greatest threat is seen to be to a university's reputation, especially amongst its older conservative donors. Universities which proudly boast of their radical tradition of protest during the civil rights era are now setting armed police against their student body. And at the same time, they're cravenly promising the US Congress to protect free speech. So in 2024, students have understood what academics have known for some time, that managers think that they are the university and that everyone else, students and staff, are placed outside that enclosure. We see a growing divergence between the ostensive university and the more secretive, furtive actions of management, which undermine critical scholarship. As Henry Giroux wrote this week, the reach of the carceral state has now been expanded to include higher education. In 2021, at the University of Leicester, scholars of critical management studies in the business school were selected for redundancy simply by dint of having the word critical in the title of a journal article or in the title of a journal to which they wanted to submit. The same fate was visited on scholars in political economy. The purge was not due to any weakness in research or failure to score in the REF. It was evident in the fact that Leicester Business School was known internationally for critical management studies, thanks to a renowned figurehead in Gibson Burrell, who was himself axed. The wanton destruction at Leicester was memorialised in a paper entitled Crawling from the Wreckage by Fleming et al., written while 4 of the 5 editors were threatened with redundancy. The wreckage is neoliberal reforms, market orientation, performance regimes, and increased precarity. They write, engagement in critical scholarship at Leicester University effectively became a dismissible offence, and with it the expectation that non-orthodoxy, disciplinary or institutional critique might be afforded academic freedom. It's the most egregious violation of academic freedom and ideological intrusion by a university that I've ever encountered. But it hasn't apparently perturbed the government, which is currently trying to push through Parliament a very heavy-handed bill which purports to defend academic freedom of speech. Unfortunately, university faculty, staff, and students very often mount little resistance. Rarely are there strikes or walkouts over the colleague who is silenced or made redundant over their dissident views. In a recent interview, Stephen Salaita, who was fired en route to his new tenured job at the University of Illinois in a controversy over the content of an essay, said that for university managers, critical thinking is merely a brand signifier. The moment it becomes an avocation, that is, a practice trained on identifying and undermining systems of power, it becomes unwelcome. Administrators and many faculty like to think of critical thinking in the abstract, as a command of theoretical material, say, and not as a practice that intervenes in systems of justice. Least of all, those on the campus itself. Critical thinking is tamed precisely at the point that it threatens to deliver on its promise. The costs of this to the higher education sector are enormous. In order to prevent academics taking legal action, UK universities spent 87 million on non-disclosure agreements between 2017 and 2019. As we've seen in the recent UK post office scandal, managers make it a priority to defend the reputation of the business, and they see potential disrepute everywhere but in their own actions. However, universities conveniently leave out provisions stated in the UNESCO 1997 Declaration on Academic Freedom, including tenure and the right and opportunity without discrimination of any kind according to their abilities to take part in the governing bodies and to criticise the functioning of higher education institutions including their own. When academics are subject to social media surveillance, this opens you up to some quite pernicious charges, entirely at the whim of university managers. And indeed, I ended my career with 2 charges of gross misconduct when I was pursued in this way. In the UK, a limited degree of academic freedom is afforded you only if you check off all of these criteria: that you have a permanent post, teach on courses which attract increasing numbers of students, teach on courses that students find pleasurable, straightforward, and which lead to identifiable career paths. You research in a popular area which the government prioritises for grant funding, and you stay within that area regardless of your own curiosity, and that you be successful in the terms of metricised achievements recognised by your university. Academic freedom is not a restricted commodity. It's not on ration. It's the entitlement of all academics, for the very good reason that it is a prerequisite for democracy and free enquiry. We're entering a very gloomy period for higher education, where the funding policies of the last 20 years have finally driven the sector towards the brink of economic ruin. Unless the government that we select in the UK on July the 4th makes rapid changes to the funding model, it's fairly certain that several universities will not exist in 2 years' time, to the detriment of the students and the communities those universities serve. Currently, about 50 UK universities have announced academic staff redundancies and professional staff redundancies. And that does not count the many more casual posts which will inevitably have been erased even before that point. This risks universities entering a financial and educational death spiral, where people who create value are displaced by managers who oversee endless restructuring carried out in the name of efficiency and competitiveness. As Jonathan Mills points out, central administration isn't productive. It's there to support the rest and get capital. What happens is that in our data-driven decision-making process, any department with even a temporary dip in applications, or a subject which might have received bad press in the media, is placed at risk for closure. The university makes this decision on cost grounds. Why invest in a loss-making department, except there is no return to profit in a top-heavy organisation where massive costs have accrued to management and administration? So that makes more departments look unprofitable. So you close them, on, until the entire university begins to totter. So, for example, the University of Huddersfield in the UK, this is its 4th successive summer that there have been job losses and course closures. This is not normal teach out and curriculum renewal. So Jonathan Mills says the overheads have to be allocated somewhere else over fewer departments. That means another unit looks unprofitable, so they close that. Then more departments look bad, and the death spiral begins and destroys all of the productive units one by one until it all goes bust. The arts and humanities have been the first to be culled in UK higher education. Liberal arts colleges in the US are closing one after the other. And yet the UK regulator, the Office for Students, has had nothing to say, preferring to echo one government-initiated and media-inflamed moral panic after another. Freedom of speech, bans on campus protests, railing against safe spaces for minority students. But then they threaten sanctions on campuses where there are protests or even discussions of Palestine. They had nothing to say about course closures and falling roles at some universities until the 16th of May 2024, when suddenly they woke up and recognised that 10 years of trashing UK universities, discouraging overseas students, and refusing to mitigate inflationary costs has caused a crisis which is now escalating to cause the implosion of the higher education sector. The neoliberal model of higher education has failed because universities are not marketplaces of services. They are repositories of knowledge and institutions of research, and that is what draws students to them. But unfortunately, we live in an era during which the pursuit of knowledge and free argument have been stifled by anti-intellectualism and what Henry Giroux calls pedagogies of repression. And as Leif Weatherby says, knowledge that is supposedly useless cannot be subtracted from the academic enterprise. What I've tried to do in this paper is show the linkage between ideology, discourse, and subjectivity, which allows structures of governance to exert their power and control into the institutions that sustain culture and democracy. In the neoliberal managerial academy, one is silenced at the same time as one is subject to the forcible citation of a discourse which inaugurates a new kind of subject. It becomes impermissible to try and articulate a reality outside of that which management wants us to inhabit. However, this model in itself offers its own vulnerability to resistance. When we notice a disjuncture of discourse with our own values, in that recognition, we bring about the potential for refusal to be contained within a marketized reality. The refusal to be interpolated as a metricized, casualized academic. The refusal to be objectified. When we call it out with like-minded colleagues, we amplify that into collective resistance. Donna Lacklow offers this insight. Refusal is not participating in those systems, not accepting the authority of their underlying premises. Refusal happens among people who don't have access to structural power. Refusal is a rejection of framing premises. Recognizing refusal requires attention and credit to tactics such as obfuscation or deliberate misinterpretation. When I was in an academic post, I'd often come home and exclaim to my partner that this just makes my head explode. Such is the emotional impact of daily dissembling. It's in large part responsible for the crisis in mental health in UK universities I wrote about in 2018. Quite how do you refute managerial hyperscrupulosity? How do you contest their version of efficiency, quality, and the most contradictory of all, support? Some take refuge in quiet quitting, but I found it essential to verbalize, analyze, and interrogate in order to help other people recognize their own situations. And responses to my blog confirm what a difference this can make. I offer a way forward beginning with Etienne Wenger's theory of community of practice. Community of practice is something we build from the ground up. It's a community we're socialized into by learning its codes, its routines, its ways of being. As undergraduates entering universities, we lack that tacit knowledge that others understand about how to operate as an academic. A community of practice is identified by mutual engagement, joint enterprise, shared repertoire. Learning to be a member of a community of practice also means learning to recognize who belongs, who is acting in an intelligent way, and who is defined as an outsider. And it's something that we learn to be as we go through academia, from undergraduate to postgraduate to hopefully getting a post in a university. This overview of the last 4 decades of shifting academic subjectivities demonstrates that they have failed the test of authenticity. They're not fully inhabited by academics. They have forced academics to become outsiders in their own environment. We have forgotten that negotiating a joint enterprise gives rise to the relations of mutual accountability among those involved, responsibility with respect to what makes life harder for others, because they all understand that making life bearable is part of their joint enterprise. We can make life bearable if we work to resist these blow-through discourses and these simulacra of academic identities. We can do it if we do more boundary work to instantiate alternative and resistant communities of practice. We cannot go on allowing inauthentic subjectivities to suppress the natural inclination of academics to follow their own ideas and curiosity. If those of us in the critical tradition do not lead by example, we then abandon succeeding generations to exploitation and the cynical strategies of game playing and racketeering. It's essential to act on our rational instincts, because this isn't just a financial crisis for universities, it is existential. Thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to your questions.